The first thing Nathaniel Nate Dawson carried into the world was not a lullaby or a blessing, but a burden stitched into his skin. From the moment he was born, a swelling had pressed itself at the base of his neck, a lump of flesh and shadow that doctors called a congenital tumor. It was not a name he understood as an infant, but it was a presence he would come to know intimately the way others knew the sound of their heartbeat. His parents, ordinary people stitched together by hope and exhaustion, stood by his hospital crib with a silence that was heavier than words. His father, Richard, a man of calloused hands and weary shoulders, could only nod numbly when the doctor spoke of surgery. His mother, Eleanor, pressed trembling fingers to her lips, already calculating the impossible arithmetic of survival against poverty. They lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town where roofs leaked when storms arrived and groceries were rationed with precision. For the Dawsons, survival meant compromises. Richard working double shifts at a lumber yard. Eleanor sewing clothes for neighbors at night. Surgery was a mountain that stretched beyond sight, and so the tumor grew with the boy. By the time Nate turned 8, the lump at his nape was no longer a quiet secret hidden beneath blankets. It was visible a protrusion that tugged at his posture, forcing his head downward. Children at school noticed. Children always noticed. They pointed, whispered, and gave him names he wished he had never heard. The hunch, the lump, the monster's neck. Nate learned quickly that laughter could be crueler than silence. He walked through hallways with his head bowed, not only because the tumor made it painful to tilt upward, but because lowering his gaze meant lowering the chance of meeting anyone else's eyes. And yet, within him, a world richer than ridicule quietly bloomed. In the corner of his small bedroom stood a piano, old, scarred, and gifted by a neighbor who no longer had space for it. Its keys were uneven, its wood scratched, but when Nate pressed his small fingers against the ivory, something extraordinary happened. Notes spilled out like water breaking free from a cracked dam. Music became the only place where he was not the boy with the lump, but the boy with a voice. Nights in the Dawson household were filled with two sounds, the distant hum of Richard returning from work boots heavy with dust, and the hesitant melodies that Nate coaxed out of his piano. Eleanor often lingered outside his door, listening. Her tired heart caught between sorrow and awe. She saw in those notes a promise that her son was not defined by what grew at his neck, but by what blossomed in his spirit. Still, the world outside his room was less forgiving. At school, Nate sat alone during lunch. His lunchbox was often half empty, packed with whatever his parents could afford, day-old bread, a few slices of apple. Other children traded snacks and jokes. He traded silence for safety. When teachers called on him, his voice came out in a whisper as if afraid it might draw too much attention. There was a loneliness about him that even adults struggled to bridge. They saw his bowed head and assumed shyness, but it was not shyness, it was armor. Every cruel laugh and every whisper behind his back became another layer in the wall he built around himself. And yet every time his fingers touched the piano, the wall cracked. He wrote melodies in his head when he could not write them on paper. He imagined symphonies while sitting at the back of the classroom tuning out the hum of lessons he could not focus on. Music was his rebellion, his sanctuary, and his prayer. It was the one place where he could lift his head if not physically, then spiritually. But tumors are heavy things, and not only on the body. By evening, Nate often lay on his bed staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering why he had been born different. Why his parents had to whisper in worried tones when they thought he could not hear. Why the world seemed to shrink away from him before it had ever fully opened. He wondered, too, if he would ever be more than the lump on his neck. One night, as rain tapped against the window, he pressed his hands against the piano keys and let the storm outside guide him. The melody that rose was fragile at first, trembling like raindrops, but soon it grew bold, matching the thunder. It was as though his heart had found language, and in that moment he did not feel broken. He felt infinite. Unbeknownst to him, Eleanor stood in the doorway, tears gathering in her eyes. She did not interrupt. She simply let her son's music wash over her, stitching warmth into a night that might have otherwise felt cold. She whispered a prayer not for riches, not even for miracles, but for Nate to one day be seen not as a child marked by deformity, but as a soul destined for more. And so the days moved forward like hesitant notes in a song not yet finished. The tumor still grew, the money for surgery still remained out of reach, and the children at school still pointed and laughed. But within Nate, the music grew louder, stronger, more insistent. It was as if his spirit knew what his body did not, that he was meant to rise somehow against the weight that dragged him down. Every night he sat at the piano, a boy with a scar he had not yet earned, playing as though the world might one day listen. The piano had become his truest companion. It sat at the far end of Nate Dawson's small bedroom, pressed against a peeling wall where dampness had left faint stains. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a relic, a battered frame. Its varnish chipped a couple of keys, yellowed with age. But to Nate, it was a cathedral. Each time he sat before it, shoulders bent beneath the weight of his tumor, he stepped into a sanctuary where no one laughed, no one whispered, and no one stared. He discovered the language of keys instinctively, as if his hands remembered something older than his years. At first he tapped hesitantly, imitating tunes he'd heard from passing radios or faintly from the town church bells. But soon, notes began to come unbidden, unchained, born from places inside him that words could never reach. The music he played was not always happy. How could it be when most of his days were filled with stares and silence? Some nights his melodies mourned slow and aching like the sound of rain dripping endlessly from a leaking gutter. Other times they surged upward, fierce and insistent, as though challenging the world that had branded him as different. It was his diary, except instead of words he wrote with sound. He gave each melody names no one would ever know. Shadow's Lullaby, The Boy Who Walked Alone, Sky Without Chains. In these pieces he poured not only loneliness, but also his unspoken dreams to run freely without pain pulling at his neck, to laugh without flinching, to one day be known for something greater than the weight he carried behind his head. Outside his room, the world moved with indifference. His father's boots still trudged home late, carrying exhaustion heavier than groceries. His mother still sat by the dim light of a lamp, stitching clothes for pennies. Bills gathered on the kitchen table like storm clouds. And yet, when Nate played, the house changed. The air softened as though the music wove invisible threads around the weary hearts within it. Eleanor would pause her sewing, allowing herself to breathe in the tenderness of her son's gift. Richard, though rarely given to sentiment, sometimes lingered outside the door longer than he admitted, his rough hands curling into fists as if the sound reminded him of all he wished he could give his boy. But to Nate, the piano was not about an audience. It was about survival. At school, he remained the boy on the margins. The cafeteria's chatter swirled around him like a storm he could not enter. On the playground, games unfolded with laughter and sweat while he sat apart sketching notes on scraps of paper scavenged from discarded assignments. Teachers praised his politeness but mistook his silence for timidity, never guessing at the symphonies he carried inside. He did not correct them. Why would he? The world had already written its story about him, and it had little room for revisions. So he wrote his own. On winter nights, when frost gathered on the window pane, he played until his fingers ached. The keys were sometimes stiff with cold, but his music carried warmth enough to chase shadows. He imagined grand halls where chandeliers glittered and strangers leaned forward in reverent silence as he played. He imagined thunderous applause, not because he craved fame, but because applause meant recognition. It meant being seen. In reality, the only applause came from his own heart beating faster when a melody finally resolved the way he hoped. But even solitude has its gifts. Because no one was listening, Nate dared to experiment. He layered melodies with complexities beyond his years, weaving sorrow into hope, pain into beauty. Each note became both confession and rebellion. I am not just the boy with the tumor. I am more. One evening, Eleanor pushed open the door quietly, a tray of soup in her hands. Nate did not hear her at first. He was too lost in the swell of a piece he had been shaping for weeks. His small body leaned into the key's eyes closed as if the world had disappeared. Eleanor froze in the doorway watching. For a moment she saw not her son hunched under the cruel weight of biology, but an artist, pure, luminous, transcendent. Her eyes stung with tears. She wished she could bottle this sound, carry it into the hospital that had once told her surgery was impossible, and play it for every doctor until they understood that this boy deserved more than statistics and dismissals. But she said nothing. She simply placed the tray on the bedside table and let him finish her heart-whispering prayers through every note. Later, when Nate finally opened his eyes, she touched his hair gently and murmured, "Keep playing, sweetheart." He looked up at her shy, uncertain, but in his chest something stirred the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, his music mattered. Still, his secret remained largely his own. Nate did not boast. He did not share. In a world where cruelty had taught him to hide, music became his most guarded treasure. Like a flame in the wind, he shielded it carefully, afraid it might be extinguished by mockery if exposed too soon. And so his symphony grew in silence. But silence, like soil, can be fertile. From it, roots deepened. His compositions grew richer, his imagination bolder. By the time he turned 9, Nate had written more melodies than he could count, though none existed on paper. They lived in his fingers, in his memory, in the place between pain and possibility. He did not yet know that the walls of his bedroom would not always contain them. He did not yet know that one day a single song would escape the confines of secrecy and find its way into the ears of others' ears that would not mock but marvel. For now, his gift remained hidden like treasure buried deep underground. Only he and the piano knew its worth. And in that hiddenness, Nate learned the most important truth, that even if the world turned away, even if he was forced to bow his head under the weight of his tumor, he could always lift it inwardly through music, through creation, through the symphony no one else yet heard. The Spring Festival was an annual tradition at the elementary school, a small but hopeful attempt to weave community from the threads of children's laughter and the smell of lemonade stands. For most, it was a day of games, balloons, and paper banners painted in bright colors. For Nate Dawson, it was usually a day of survival. Festivals meant crowds, and crowds meant eyes. Eyes that wandered, eyes that lingered, eyes that saw the lump at the back of his neck before they saw him. This year, however, something unexpected stirred. The school's music teacher, Mr. Whitaker, was a man often overlooked himself. Tall, slightly stooped, with a thinning crown of hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, he carried the air of someone who had long ago chosen to value listening over speaking. In classrooms filled with chatter and clatter, he was known for the stillness he carried an anchor for restless children. On that particular afternoon, as students rehearsed for the festival talent show, Mr. Whitaker wandered the hallways, pausing when faint notes trickled through a door left slightly ajar. It was not the clumsy plinking of children learning scales, nor the rote repetition of a nursery rhyme. It was something deeper, fragile, yet urgent, as if the player's heart had been distilled into sound. Curiosity tugged at him. He stepped closer. Inside the dimly lit room, he saw Nate. The boy sat hunched at the old piano shoulders, sloping forward under the cruel weight of the tumor that defined his silhouette. Yet his fingers, small, pale, determined, moved across the keys with the certainty of someone who belonged to the music more than he belonged to the world. Mr. Whitaker did not interrupt. He simply stood at the threshold listening, letting the melody unfurl like a secret revealed. The piece was unpolished, yes, but it carried something raw, something unteachable, honesty. When the final note lingered in the air, trembling like a held breath, Nate looked up and startled at the sight of him. His eyes widened, a mix of fear and shame, as if he had been caught trespassing in a world not meant for him. But Mr. Whitaker only smiled gently. He said nothing. Words might have scattered the fragile courage it had taken for the boy to play at all. Instead, he stepped forward slow and deliberate, and placed a hand lightly on the piano's edge as though paying respect not to the instrument but to the spirit it had just carried. In that silence, something shifted. For perhaps the first time, Nate felt seen not for the lump, not for the bowed head, but for the music. From then on, Mr. Whitaker began to linger after school. Sometimes he offered Nate simple exercises, sometimes he merely listened. He never forced, never demanded, but created a space where Nate's music could breathe without fear of ridicule. Slowly, the boy's shoulders eased, if only in that one room. Nate's world began to change in small increments. He no longer rushed home immediately after classes. Instead, he found himself drawn to the music room where the old upright piano waited. There, under Mr. Whitaker's quiet presence, he allowed himself to play louder, braver. The melodies that once belonged only to his bedroom walls now filled a space meant for others to hear. Mr. Whitaker was not blind to the reality. He knew the cruelty Nate faced in hallways the way children whispered when they thought adults weren't watching. He knew, too, that the family struggled that hospital bills sat unpaid on the Dawsons' kitchen table. But he also knew that music could sometimes hold a child together when the world tried to pull him apart. It was he who first suggested the festival. There's a talent show, he mentioned casually one afternoon as if it were nothing more than a passing thought. The school could use a pianist. Nate froze, hands hovering above the keys. Fear surged instantly. The thought of standing before a crowd, the thought of eyes drilling into his neck before they ever listened to his music, it was unbearable. Mr. Whitaker did not push. He only said, "Sometimes the world doesn't know what it needs until it hears it." The words lodged themselves inside Nate like a seed dormant but alive. At night he returned home restless. At dinner he barely touched his food. His father noticed the distance but said nothing, worn from a day that had left his hands raw. His mother, however, studied his face, catching the flicker of something she hadn't seen before possibility. Back in his room, Nate sat before his battered piano. He imagined the gymnasium filled with parents and students, the bright lights, the laughter, the whispers. His stomach clenched. But then he imagined something else, a silence just before the first note, and then the music carrying above everything, above the stairs, above the cruelty, above the lump. He pressed a key, then another. Slowly he began to shape a piece for the festival, unsure if he would ever find the courage to share it, but unable to stop writing it all the same. Days passed. The festival loomed closer. Mr. Whitaker never mentioned it again directly, but his eyes held a quiet encouragement whenever Nate entered the room. It was enough. Encouragement without pressure, faith without demand. For Nate, it was the first time an adult outside his family had offered such faith. And faith, once given, is difficult to return unopened. As rehearsal week arrived, the hallways buzzed with chatter about performances. Some children prepared dances, others practiced jokes, still others carried props and costumes. Nate walked among them unnoticed, yet carrying within him a storm of anticipation and dread. At home, his mother asked gently if he planned to play. He only shrugged, afraid to voice the terror that gnawed at him. Yet she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Whatever you choose, your music already speaks for you." The night before the festival, Nate could not sleep. He lay awake listening to the creak of the house settling the whistle of wind against the window. He thought of the tumor pressing against his pillow, a reminder of how he appeared to the world. But then he thought of the piano of the piece he had composed in secrecy, and of Mr. Whitaker's words. Sometimes the world doesn't know what it needs until it hears it. When dawn broke, pale and uncertain, Nate knew his choice. He would play. He would carry his secret symphony into the open, fragile as it was. And if the world chose to laugh, then at least it would laugh at music too powerful to be ignored. The gymnasium smelled faintly of varnished wood and popcorn. Rows of folding chairs lined the floor while paper streamers sagged from the rafters like tired rainbows. For most children, the spring festival was a celebration, a chance to laugh, perform, and revel in attention. For Nate Dawson, it was a battlefield. He stood behind the curtained knees, trembling hands clammy despite the coolness of the evening. Beyond the heavy fabric, he could hear the restless murmur of the crowd, parents greeting neighbors, students giggling, teachers attempting order. Each sound pressed against him like a weight. The tumor at the base of his neck throbbed, a constant reminder of the cruel gaze it invited. He pulled his collar higher, though he knew it was useless. No amount of fabric could conceal what had already branded him. Mr. Whitaker appeared beside him not with words of command but with silence that steadied. He placed a hand briefly on Nate's shoulder, light as a feather, and nodded. That was enough. When Nate's name was called, the world seemed to still. He stepped onto the stage. The gymnasium lights were brighter than he expected, spilling across his small frame and casting sharp shadows. For a moment, the weight of every eye in the room bore down on him. He felt exposed as though the tumor glowed more brightly than the spotlight itself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, familiar whispers, the same he had endured in hallways and classrooms. His throat tightened. Panic clawed at him. He wanted to flee, to run back into the dark where his music was safe. Then his eyes found the piano. It stood center stage, waiting, its keys gleaming faintly. Not perfect, not grand, but familiar. It was the same battered companion he had known in his bedroom, the same friend that had absorbed his loneliness night after night. He walked toward it, sat down, closed his eyes, and breathed. The first note was hesitant trembling, like a voice unused to being heard. The gymnasium fell quiet. He pressed another key, then another. Slowly, the melody he had carried in secret began to unfurl, fragile yet insistent. At first, the music seemed to waver under the weight of silence, but then something shifted. Nate's fingers grew steadier. His body swayed gently with the rhythm. The piano, once only an escape, became a bridge. Each note was a step outward, a declaration. See me, hear me. I am more than what you think I am. The melody swelled. It carried sorrow, years of ridicule, of whispered names and cruel laughter. But it also carried defiance, the spark of a boy who refused to be only the sum of his pain. It rose stronger and stronger until the gymnasium no longer contained a scared child, but a soul set free. The audience sat frozen. Parents who had only come to clap politely found themselves gripped by something unexpected. Children who had once mocked him leaned forward wide-eyed as though hearing him for the first time. Even the teachers, accustomed to routine performances, exchanged glances, their faces softened by awe. Nate played as if he had always belonged there. His fingers flew delicate yet certain, weaving a story without words. For the first time in his life, he lifted his head, not with his neck still bowed by the weight of his tumor, but with his spirit. When the final note echoed into silence, it lingered like a held breath. Then came the sound he had never dared to imagine: applause. It began softly, a few hands clapping, then grew swelling into a roar that filled the gymnasium. Some stood unable to remain seated. Others wiped tears, uncertain why the performance of a boy they had overlooked struck so deeply. Nate sat frozen at the piano, stunned. He had expected whispers, ridicule, perhaps even laughter. But applause. He had never prepared for applause. His chest ached, not from the tumor, but from something larger, an ache of release, of recognition, of finally being seen. From the wings, Mr. Whitaker clapped the hardest, his eyes shining with pride. That night, Nate's name spread beyond the walls of the school. Parents spoke of him with reverence. Children retold the story of the boy who played like an angel, and whispers became not of cruelty, but of wonder. At home, his mother held him tighter than ever before. His father, often a man of few words, cleared his throat and muttered something about dust in the air before retreating to the kitchen. But his eyes betrayed the truth, pride fierce and uncontainable. Nate lay awake that night, the sound of applause echoing in his mind long after the last clap had faded. For the first time, he believed in the possibility of a future not overshadowed by his tumor. For the first time, he dreamed not of escape, but of becoming. He did not yet know that this was only the beginning, that the applause would ripple outward, stirring hearts he had never met, that his music would soon become more than just a secret refuge. But as he drifted into sleep, one truth remained steady: the world had listened. And once the world listens, it cannot easily forget. The applause from the spring festival did not end that night. It traveled like an echo, carried in whispers down school corridors, retold at grocery counters, repeated in pews on Sunday mornings. People spoke of the boy with the lump on his neck, who played as though he had been born not into suffering, but into music. For the first time in his short life, Nate Dawson's name was not followed by cruel laughter, but by reverence. Yet, the human body does not bend easily to the applause of others. In the weeks that followed, Nate's health wavered. At first, it was small headaches that throbbed longer than usual, dizzy spells that blurred the edges of his sight. His mother noticed the way he rubbed the back of his neck, more often the way his shoulders sagged even when he wasn't carrying his school bag. His father, though less attuned to subtleties, caught the pallor in his cheeks, the fatigue in his step. Then came the collapse. It happened one quiet afternoon in the music room. Nate had been practicing, the notes flowing with unusual intensity as though he were racing against time itself. Mr. Whitaker, grading papers at his desk, looked up just in time to see the boy falter. Hands slipping from the keys, his body crumpling to the floor with a thud that silenced the room. Panic tore through the teacher. He rushed to Nate's side, calling his name, but the boy's eyes fluttered closed, his breath, shallow skin, clammy. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and soon the wail of sirens carried him away. News spread faster than fire. By evening, the town knew the boy who had enchanted them with his piano was now fighting for his life. The tumor doctors explained had grown dangerously pressing against nerves threatening vital functions. Surgery was no longer a question of if, but of when and whether money could arrive before time ran out. The Dawsons sat in the sterile brightness of the hospital, listening to words that felt like thunder. The figures for the surgery were astronomical, to them unattainable. Eleanor wept quietly, her hands gripping Nate's as if sheer love could anchor him to this world. Richard sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, fury at his own helplessness simmering beneath the surface. For the community, the revelation was a summons. People remembered the festival night, the way the gymnasium had fallen into silence, the way their hearts had been moved. They remembered the fragile boy bent over the piano, creating beauty from pain. And now, faced with the possibility of losing him, something inside them refused to let it happen. A campaign began small at first. A teacher set out a donation jar in the school office. A neighbor organized a bake sale. A local shop promised to give a portion of their earnings. But soon, the story spread beyond town borders, carried by newspapers and radio stations. The boy with the tumor, who played like an angel, now needs saving. Donations began to pour in. Letters arrived, some with crumpled bills from strangers who had little to give, others with checks from those moved by compassion. Messages flooded in prayers, encouragement stories from others who had faced illness and endured. Eleanor read them aloud at Nate's bedside. Though weak, his eyes lit up faintly with each word, as if the voices of strangers stitched threads of hope into his frail body. The hospital days were long and heavy. Machines beeped rhythmically, a cruel substitute for music. Nate drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes dreaming of piano keys, sometimes lost in pain. But always when he woke, his mother was there, whispering softly, "Hold on. We are not alone anymore." The campaign reached a crescendo. The community, once indifferent or even cruel to the boy's difference, now rallied as though saving him was saving something within themselves. Fundraisers filled church basements. Posters lined storefronts, and children sold lemonade on street corners, proudly declaring the cause. The sound of his music still lingered in their minds, urging them forward. Then, one evening, Mr. Whitaker visited. He carried no papers, no instructions, only a portable radio. He placed it gently on the bedside table, turned the dial, and out came the broadcast of a local station retelling Nate's story. The announcer's voice trembled with emotion as he spoke of the boy who had turned suffering into song. They played a recording from the festival. A teacher had captured it on an old camcorder. The room filled with Nate's own music. Though his body lay weak in the hospital bed, the sound seemed to awaken him. He turned his head slightly, eyes glistening, and listened as though hearing it for the first time. His hands twitched faintly as if longing to return to the keys. Mr. Whitaker leaned close and whispered, "The world is listening, Nate. Don't stop playing now." The day of the surgery came like a storm. The funds miraculously had reached the target. Strangers had lifted the impossible weight from the Dawson family's shoulders. Yet relief was mixed with terror, for money could open the operating room but not guarantee its outcome. As Nate was wheeled down the sterile hallway, Eleanor held his hand until the last possible moment, whispering prayers into his skin. Richard, unable to speak, pressed a trembling kiss to his son's forehead. Then the doors closed, leaving them in the cold silence of waiting. Hours crawled by. The family sat huddled together, joined by friends, neighbors, teachers. Even the hospital chapel filled with townspeople kneeling in prayer. It seemed as though the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of a story they had now claimed as their own. When at last the surgeon emerged, mask, lowered eyes weary but soft with relief, Eleanor nearly collapsed. The words were simple, but they rang like bells. The surgery was a success. The tumor has been removed. Tears flooded the room. Richard buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Eleanor sobbed openly. Gratitude spilling out like a flood. Mr. Whitaker closed his eyes, whispering thanks into the stillness. For Nate, the path ahead would still be long recovery scars, new challenges. But the impossible had been done. The light that had nearly flickered out now burned steady once more. The hospital air was different after the surgery, lighter somehow, though it still smelled faintly of antiseptic and weary prayers. Nathaniel, Nate Dawson, woke to a silence he did not recognize. For the first time in his life, the heavy pressure at the base of his neck was gone. In its place was pain. Yes, but also absence, the startling emptiness where once a burden had lived. He reached behind his head instinctively, fingers brushing against the rough stitches, the tender ridge of skin. It was not smooth. It would never be smooth. But it was freedom, carved into flesh. His mother was the first face he saw when his eyes fluttered open. Eleanor's tears spilled freely as she pressed her lips to his forehead. His father stood nearby, shoulders trembling with a pride too heavy for words. For Nate, their faces were music enough. Recovery was slow. He learned to lift his head again tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Each movement reminded him of what had been taken and what had been restored. He still carried weakness, still carried scars, but no longer carried the tumor that had forced him to bow. At home, the piano waited. Weeks later, when his body was strong enough, he sat before it once more. His fingers hesitated on the keys as though afraid the music might not return after so much silence. But then a note rang out, fragile yet pure, followed by another and another. Soon the house filled again with sound. This time, however, the music was different. It was not the secret lament of a boy hiding from the world. It was the declaration of someone who had faced death and been pulled back into life. Each note was stitched with gratitude for surgeons, for strangers, for neighbors who had rallied when darkness threatened to consume. The community never forgot. Nate's story spread far beyond the small town. Invitations arrived for him to perform at churches' fundraisers, even city concerts. Each stage was larger than the last, each audience more eager to witness the boy who had turned suffering into song. Years passed. The boy became a young man. The young man became an artist. Nate Dawson grew into a composer whose music was sought across the country not only for its beauty, but for the story it carried. When he sat before the piano, his scar glistened faintly under stage lights, a permanent reminder of what he had overcome. He never concealed it. The scar was not shame. It was testimony. It whispered to every listener. Pain is real, but so is healing. Cruelty exists, but so does compassion. Scars remain, but they do not define us. They remind us of survival. On the night of his first major concert, the auditorium was filled to its highest balcony. The hush before his performance was the same hush he had once imagined as a boy in his bedroom. The silence that meant the world was listening. He bowed his head not from burden now, but from reverence. Then he began to play. The music soared, weaving the chapters of his life, the loneliness of childhood, the first fragile melody the night of the festival, the collapse, the surgery, and the rebirth. Each phrase was a story, each crescendo a triumph, each soft decrescendo a memory of nights when he had almost given up. The audience leaned forward, rapt. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them into places within themselves they had long ignored. Others wept openly, unable to explain why the music pierced so deeply. When the final chord trembled into silence, the hall erupted. Standing ovations thundered applause raining down like a storm. But Nate, seated quietly at the piano, did not bask. He simply looked upward, eyes shining, and whispered inwardly his gratitude for family, for faith, for the strangers who had made survival possible. His scar caught the spotlight, and, for a moment, it looked less like a wound and more like a crown. Nate's story did not end on that stage. It continued in every classroom where a teacher encouraged a hidden talent, in every community that chose compassion over indifference, in every child who felt different but discovered a gift within. His life became not only his own, but a symphony that belonged to all who heard it. And as his music spread, so did his message that scars can sing, that burdens can be lifted, and that no soul is too small to shine. If this story has touched you, let Nate's music remind you healing is possible. Hope is real. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another journey like his, because stories of resilience deserve to be shared. In later years, Nate returned often to his hometown. He played benefit concerts at the very school where he had once been mocked, raising funds for other children in need. He visited the hospital where surgeons had saved him, filling its sterile halls with melodies of gratitude. Wherever he went, he carried not only his piano, but his scar, his visible hymn of survival. People often asked him why he did not undergo cosmetic surgery to remove its trace. His answer was always the same. Why would I erase the reminder of what gave me life? And so the scar remained a soft ridge of flesh and memory, a testimony that suffering had been real, but had not won. One evening, long after his name had spread far, Nate addressed an audience at a charity event. He spoke not with grandeur, but with humility. "Music gave me a voice when I thought I had none," he said. "But it was compassion that gave me life when I thought it was ending." If you ever wonder whether kindness matters, let me be your proof. His words lingered even after the applause faded, reminding all present that healing is rarely solitary. It is woven from the hands of many. If you believe in the power of compassion and the healing of stories like Nate's, take a moment now to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing voices that inspire hope in a hurting world. In the quiet of his home, Nate sometimes still played the same battered piano from his childhood, its keys uneven, its wood scarred. It reminded him where he had begun alone, bowed, hidden. But now when he played, he did so with windows open, unafraid of who might listen. The world had already heard his song. The boy, who once lived in the shadows of ridicule, had become a man who drew light into the darkest corners. His music was not perfect, but it was true. And truth, when spoken in melody, has a way of healing even the deepest wounds. To continue walking with us through journeys of resilience, survival, and hope, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Every story shared is another reminder that even brokenness can bloom into beauty. And so the story closes not with silence, but with a final note that resonates long after it is played. A boy once forced to bow his head beneath a cruel weight now lifts it freely, scar and all. His music, born of suffering, lives on as a testament that even in the frailest bodies the strongest souls can rise, and that the weight of a birthmark can be transformed into the song of a lifetime.